It's gotten so much worse. So much worse. I'll be honest, when I made a video on the Republican CPAC conference that happened back in March and elucidated the agenda behind their unhinged ramblings, I had my doubts that it would get this bad. Sure, I acknowledge that this kind of rhetoric could be the start of something far, far worse, but there was also another part of me that thought that what was said on stage could just as easily be the final desperate sputterings of an archaic and dying ideology. As has happened before in politics all over the world, a certain group of people are scapegoated as a ploy to get a vote, without much of a policy plan actually being behind it. However, now this has changed, with the publication of this, the Mandate for Leadership, a Conservative Promise, also dubbed Project 2025, the Presidential Transition Project. Published by the Republican think tank the Heritage Foundation, and to put it bluntly, this 920-page-long authoritarian wet dream of a document is scary, and outlines a desired reality that is backwards even by Victorian England standards. And I just want to highlight this before we dive into the rhetoric in this document. The Heritage Foundation is not some New Age radical Trump-era think tank. No, this organisation has been around since Nixon. It's one of the oldest think tanks in the country and is very much a member of the Republican establishment. Therefore, this document is as close to an official Republican manifesto as you can get. This is why it's so important that we must go through and expose the lies, fear-mongering, and pageantry laid out in this dumpster fire. This tripe must be shown, elucidated, debunked, mocked, and ridiculed. As has become a pattern in not just American politics, but politics in general, the majority of the document's most vitriolic hatred seems to be reserved for trans people and the wider queer community. It begins from the very first page of the manifesto. The first page, honestly, is such a dumpster fire that let's just go through that section as a whole, transphobia included. Now, as then, our political class has been discredited by wholesale dishonesty and corruption, most of which is coming from their own camp, by the way. Look at America and the ruling and cultural elite today. Inflation is ravaging family budgets. What they won't mention, of course, is that inflation began to rise under Trump compared to Obama, was then exacerbated by the aftershocks of Trump's disastrous COVID response, and has actually been rapidly decreasing ever since Biden took office, with a reduction of nearly 50% in 2 years. Drug overdose deaths continue to escalate, except of course Republicans refuse to fund better healthcare and rehab systems that would undeniably decrease this number, and also still pursue a prison model that prioritizes punishment over rehabilitation, which only makes the problems worse. And also remind me who the two main generals in the disastrous and failed war on drugs were? Oh yeah, Reagan and Nixon. And children suffer the toxic normalization of transgenderism with drag queens and pornography invading their school libraries. Because of course, according to Republicans, telling people that trans people exist and that you should treat them the same way you treat any other human being is toxic. And of course, there is the usual fear-mongering regarding drag queens, because their rhetoric is entirely based on the notion that drag is inherently sexual, a tactic that has been debunked countless times, including by myself in my previous video on this matter. Also, it's extremely comical to me whenever they still peddle the pornography in libraries lie, given that from my own experience, whenever I have asked these people to provide an example of a book that is pornographic in a public school library, they never do, probably because there aren't any. And if they do attempt to cite one, they just pick a random book that is not pornographic at all, but merely just features a gay couple and will simply cry, "Gay pornography!" I guess by their logic, classic fairy tales like Snow White and Cinderella are straight pornography. This is a common tactic amongst bigots. As far as they're concerned, being trans is not you simply living your life freely and comfortably in your identity. No, you are both spouting an ideology, and your mere existence is pornographic. It's this rhetoric that sets up one of the most chilling authoritarian fantasies of the document, the essential outlawing of being trans. To quote the document, quote, "Pornography, manifested today in the omnipresent propagation of transgender ideology and the sexualization of children, has no claim to First Amendment protection. Its purveyors are child predators and misogynistic exploiters of women. Their product is as addictive as any illicit drug and as psychologically destructive as any crime. Pornography should be outlawed. The people who produce it and distribute it should be imprisoned. Educators who purvey it should be classed as registered sex offenders, and firms that facilitate it should be shuttered." Once again, this is not actually about pornography. As I and many others have shown, the aim is to deem everything about being trans pornographic. using words like ideology, exploiters, and product, as well as comparing someone being allowed to live as they please to being a heroin addict or murdering someone, alongside the uses of slurs like groomer, is all a pathetic attempt to fearmonger and attempt to make out that being trans is actually more than it is in reality. This is a desire to declare the mere existence of trans people as pornography, as they also want pornography to be outlawed. It's clear as day. Declare trans content porn, imprison those who make it, make teachers who discuss it, trans identities, sex offenders, and force companies who host it to close. Let me paint a picture of what world would be like if this became reality. Imagine a trans woman who runs a YouTube channel where she does baking videos. In other words, she makes content. What's wrong with that? It's an expression of a hobby, right? Wrong. That woman is making illegal pornography and she will now be imprisoned, and YouTube will be forced to remove all her videos. How about another example? A child is experiencing gender dysphoria, but comes from a bigoted household and fear the consequences of coming out to their parents. But they trust their teacher, and thus they decide to confide in them about their questioning identity. And the teacher is there to listen and reassure them that it's perfectly okay, and provides a space for the child to live as they want, at least for some of their day, before they have to go home. What's wrong with that? Looking out for students is what a good teacher should do, right? Wrong. That teacher's a groomer, and they must now be classed as a registered sex offender, lose their job, and the school must break confidentiality and out these people to their parents, who may beat and or disown their child. But remember, it's all about protecting the kids, you guys. Except for the queer ones, I guess. They don't count, apparently. The lies about trans people continue to come thick and fast, including lies about trans people in sports, framing it as transgender extremists undermining parents' and women's rights, when in reality the supposed biological advantage is blown completely out of the water by the fact that HRT significantly diminishes the areas of supposed advantage, and also because the supposed quote-unquote fixes proposed by Republicans, things like hormone level checks, would actually end up hurting a number of cis women who just have naturally high testosterone levels. Isn't it also interesting in that the hysteria about trans people is pretty much exclusively directed at trans women? They seem to either forget or just ignore that trans men exist, probably because their existence makes Republican fearmongering and propaganda all the more laughably stupid. Outlined also is a desire to reinstate the ban on transgender people serving in the military that was signed under Trump and then swiftly overturned by Biden, and to also suspend the use of public funding for reassignment surgeries for trans service members, as well as suspending the funding for abortion procedures for service members. There is also much unhinged rambling regarding welfare in America, saying that the department responsible for it should stop being woke regarding trans people, that idiotic buzzword that has precisely zero meaning and precisely zero right-wing people can define. I'll talk more about this section later, and as it has more focus on abortion and family values, quote-unquote. On top of trans service members not getting their surgery subsidized, the think tank also desires that programs like Medicare stop covering reassignment surgeries. Quote, they should acknowledge that such interventions are dangerous and acknowledge that there is insufficient scientific evidence to support the coverage. Unquote. Again, this is a total lie. SRS is no more dangerous than any other major surgery, and in fact the regret rate is much lower than other surgeries like knee replacements, hip replacements, and spinal surgeries. And in reality, medical transition is backed up by decades of scientific consensus. Every single medical body and institution will say that medical transition is the most effective way of treating gender dysphoria. Isn't it also interesting that the people who refuse to acknowledge the scientific legitimacy of trans identities, the existence of climate change, the science regarding vaccines, are now claiming to be on the side of science? In reality, they only like science when it sides with them, which is not how science works. Sorry. Then we come to workplace discrimination protections for queer people. The manifesto tells the story of a Supreme Court case, Bostock v. Clayton County, in which the court ruled that, quote, an employer who fires somebody simply for being homosexual and transgender, end quote, would be in violation of Title VIII's prohibition of discrimination. While the case was limited to the hiring and firing of employees, there have been recent attempts to expand its ruling to cover the rest of the working environment, such as bathrooms and dress codes. The think tank doesn't like this. According to them, all these extra provisions should cease and the Bostock ruling should only be applied to hiring and firing. This is a move that they will no doubt frame as stopping big government overreach, but then just 2 points down they completely contradict themselves when they express a desire for the next Republican president to rescind all protections from discrimination on the basis of sexuality, gender identity, transgender status, and sex characteristics. In other words, in their world, your boss could fire you for being gay, and that would be perfectly legal. And your landlord could evict you and make you homeless simply for being trans, and that would also be perfectly legal. From one part of the Republican playbook to another, the hysteria over abortion now. Of course, we all know how much they hate abortion and bodily autonomy. This is nothing new. But this manifesto, I suppose, gives us the best, most modern look at their policies on the matter. As usual, it's all backed up by pageantry regarding protecting the unborn, which really is an idiotic phrase when you realise that once the child is born, the Republicans won't give a monkeys about them and will refuse to fund free school meals, won't fund better healthcare, won't fund any welfare expansions to help impoverished families, and most jarringly, won't enact any policies to stop the kid potentially being shot in their own school. In other words, Republicans care more about potential children than they do about actual children. Make no mistake, no matter how much they use the term pro-life, they are not. I will always call them pro-forced birth. And if you are someone who is pro-forced birth, who is watching this, and you don't like what I've just said, then I propose a dilemma for you. It goes as follows. I am standing atop a cliff. In one hand I am holding a 10-year-old child, in the other I am holding a small petri dish that contains 10 embryos. I am going to drop them both off a cliff to certain doom. However, you can step in and be the hero, but you can only save one of them. So which one do you save? If you choose to save the child, then you show yourself to be an unprincipled hypocrite. If you choose to save the embryos, then you freely admit to the world that you do in fact value embryonic potential life over actual breathing, conscious human life. I eagerly await your responses, although I highly doubt you will respond, and will instead just resort to calling me names down in the comments section. So while you sit there and fume about that, the rest of us can go on and expose more of your lies and hysteria. Of course, anyone with a brain can identify that since abortion is an organised medical care given to an individual or community, then abortion is, by definition, healthcare. But of course, taking away people's healthcare rights looks bad, so it's in the Republicans' best interest to try and present abortion as not being healthcare. This is why they always dodge questions about their blanket abortion bans that would undoubtedly lead to the deaths of many mothers who, before the law, could have had an abortion but now are forced to carry to term. And if they don't dodge, they will downplay, saying, "Oh, but it's a small number." To which I ask, why does that matter? Surely forcing even one mother to carry to term when it could kill them, or forcing even one rape victim to go through unspeakable trauma to carry to term, is too many. One thing that they also must do is combat the correct assertion that abortion, because it is healthcare, is a right that people are entitled to. Predictably, they don't see it this way, although hilariously, in doing so, they make themselves look out to be complete morons. Because this is a party that claims that its stance against trans people is based on, quote, protecting women's rights, end quote. But then they want to start stripping women's rights when it comes to abortion. Once again, we see the party of freedom not really liking any freedom that doesn't align with their values. Remember, everybody, the Republican Party wants you to be free. Just not like that. Or that. Or that. And it's also funny that the party of banning guns won't work seem to believe that banning abortions will work, and that threatening to lock up doctors who perform them won't negatively affect their societies, even though that is indeed what is happening, as many states that have banned abortion in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade being overturned are now experiencing a shortage of healthcare professionals, especially gynecologists, as they all jump ship to other states that won't imprison them for, doing their job. Perhaps even more chillingly, the Foundation wants to see a plan put into action that would essentially make abortion for anyone living in restricted states impossible. As of right now, some states have, and some states haven't, criminalized abortion. So there is nothing to stop a mother from, say, Texas, from traveling to a nearby state that does allow abortion to have one, and that abortion clinic will maintain confidentiality, as all healthcare providers do and should. Of course, this is not ideal, and is not financially viable for everyone, but at least it's something. However, under the next Republican president, the think tank wants to see a plan put into action that would force states to divulge all the information on abortions carried out within its borders, such as how many abortions were carried out, the reason for them, the method used, and more worryingly, the residence of the mother, presumably so that police could then be sent to her house to drag her off to prison for daring to have an abortion. So yeah, take a fat dump all over confidentiality in healthcare, force other states to divulge information, and enact a giant overarching national undertaking. But remember everybody, this is the party of small government. Another curious pattern that I noticed when I was reading through the manifesto was just how often abortion is brought up when it isn't at all relevant to the point that is being made, or attempting to be made. Have a look at this. While the word transgender appears just 13 times in the whole document, or about once every 70 pages, the word abortion appears nigh on 200 times, or just once every 4.5 pages. In almost every instance that the word woke appears in relation to a particular policy or government agency, you can bet that abortion isn't far behind. It appears that the Republicans simply use abortion as a buzzword to fill in for whenever they don't actually have an argument, which is quite often. probably because they know that their voter base responds better to outrage than actual evidence and substance, and they also know that most of their voter base is devoutly religious and therefore anti-abortion. Therefore, they know they can spout whatever tripe they want, and as long as they tack on abortion, their voters will simply nod their heads and support whatever they say. And this isn't the only buzzword they like to use. Now, this is going to be a bold statement, at least to Republicans, but climate change exists and is a problem, and we should probably do something about it. Much like with trans rights, science is not on their side, even more so when it comes to the climate. If on trans rights they have simply lost the scientific battle, on climate change they have practically been nuked from orbit. They have already been beaten so badly that there is not enough for them to simply lie about the science that already exists. Instead, they want the president to start interfering with the scientific community and reshape climate change research programs, which translates to reduce their funding or just outright stop their funding altogether because their science bothers us. Again, party of small government, you guys. Again, the manifesto doesn't actually cite any science for all of its whining about climate change, mostly either just using it as another idiotic buzzword like abortion and woke, or making claims that are so outlandish and dumb it's hard to imagine that a grown adult actually wrote this garbage. For example, take this claim. You know how Russia's war in Ukraine caused a spike in global energy prices, a problem which was then made worse in many countries by extensive corporate price gouging from energy corporations like BP and Shell? Well, according to the think tank, none of that's real. That was all actually Biden's fault. That's right, Biden caused it all, apparently. The manifesto also fails at even the most basic logic. The claim that climate change does not cause poverty, which is so laughably stupid if you make your living by being a farmer in a country that is heavily affected by climate change, and the climate change causes your crops to fail, and you no longer have any income, or any food for that matter. In other words, it's caused poverty. Come on, even a child can understand this. Once again, it speaks volumes that they cannot combat climate change on scientific grounds, so they are instead forced to resort to populist babbling about climate policies killing the economy. Does that even have a kernel of truth? Shocker, no. If anything, the opposite's the truth. Not enacting climate policies is what's hurting the economy. The UK, for instance, subsidises fossil fuel industry to the tune of £100 billion a year. Think of all the extra programs to help the impoverished that could be funded with that. You'd even have some left over to fund research into green technologies, allowing them to then become cheaper and more efficient and more readily adopted. But of course, the Republicans are too blinded by the oil money lining their pockets to care. And this isn't the only way that they trample all over science and endanger people's lives in the process. And just because no quartet of populist trash would ever be complete without it, let's talk about vaccines. Remember back before COVID when anti-vaxxers used to be somewhat rare, limited only to Facebook mum groups rambling about mercury and autism? Yeah, now being anti-vax seems to be standard Republican policy. Of course, they have to posture as the party of freedom, so they decide to, right out of the gate, label mask and vaccine mandates as the greatest threat to America. And they firmly state that the president should not issue mask or vaccine mandates. They also advocate for rehiring any government employees who are dismissed for not getting vaccinated, thus showing that they are willing to put all of their colleagues and the public in danger in the name of freedom. Also, the fact that a mainstream Republican think tank is putting the word vaccine in quotation marks is concerning, and just shows that conspiracies about vaccines are either part of their policy or they are willing to pander to their more conspiratorial voters. It does beg the question, doing this implies that the COVID jab wasn't a vaccine, but how is that true? It is a substance designed to induce an immune response from the body to provide protection from a pathogen. It is, by definition, a vaccine. And it's not just here that the think tank decides to throw actual science and objective truth out of the window in favour of conspiratorial tripe, as they decide to ramble about how masks provide little to no benefit and might even be counterproductive. They accuse the CDC of cherry-picking data for political purposes. It's safe to say all of this simply isn't true. Masks work, end of story. They reduce transmission by up to 83%. To claim otherwise is not only false, but dangerous and disgusting. And the anti-vax propaganda train keeps on rolling, with claims about the Moderna COVID vaccine being experimental. This is a ploy to take advantage of people not knowing what vaccines actually do, as well as to play on people's fears regarding new technology. So I'll say it plain and simple for you right now. The COVID mRNA vaccines are not experimental. They completed all of the medical trials that any other vaccine goes through. It just didn't take as long, one, because this is probably the most extensive scientific collaboration in human history, and two, because all of the red tape between the trial stages was removed, either due to emergency, or in other words, stage 2 was being done before stage 1 was actually finished, rather than waiting for months in between, like usual. And so I'll also just explain what the mRNA vaccines actually do and what they actually are, since that topic has also been rife with conspiracy. A regular vaccine contains viral particles that are attenuated, or weakened, to induce an immune response from the body once its spiked proteins are recognized. You all learnt this in Year 10 biology. The downside of these, of course, is that you're working with an active virus, which can cause all sorts of problems. And occasionally this has happened in history. One of the most dangerous things that can happen is that the virus is not attenuated enough. During the 1955 polio vaccine mandate, yes, people, vaccine mandates were invented before COVID, not during, a batch of the vaccines wasn't attenuated enough. So when it was given to people, it just gave them polio. In this regard, the mRNA vaccine is much safer because it doesn't actually contain any viral particles at all. See, the spike proteins are really all that's needed to induce an immune response in the body. And they are simply proteins that can be made synthetically without any need for viral particles at all. So, you synthetically produce viral RNA strands, which is where the name comes from, that code to produce spike proteins and then inject them into the body rather than the virus itself. In this way, an incident like what happened in 1955 is simply impossible. One of the main conspiracies is that the vaccine can alter your DNA because it contains viral RNA. Whoever you've heard tell you this is either ignorant or knowingly lying, because that's not how it works. The process goes DNA to RNA. It cannot go in reverse. This is biologically impossible. However, while the document doesn't spout all of the lies about vaccines, they do play into some of them. This includes the aborted fetal cells argument. No, vaccines do not actually contain aborted fetal tissue. To be fair, the document at least doesn't stoop that low, but many of their voters will. But like many conspiracies, they are at least structured around a microscopic kernel of truth. That being that a traditional vaccine requires the growth of viral particles that are going to be used in them, and all vaccines, including the mRNA vaccines, require testing on human tissue. For both of these purposes, fetal stem cell lines are used as they can be both replicated and used indefinitely. These cells were acquired from 2 legally aborted fetuses in the 1960s. In other words, it's the most tangential relationship to abortion that you can get, but it doesn't matter when Republicans need to fearmonger to their devoutly religious and anti-abortion voter base. These stem cell lines were/are instrumental in pretty much all vaccines since their development, including the smallpox vaccine, which has unquestionably saved millions of lives. So from all the people who are anti-abortion to protect human life, what matters more? Millions upon millions or lives, or 2 fetuses that were aborted 6 decades ago? And even so, the argument that vaccine mandates are horrible and un-American are just beyond stupid. It's mandatory for the same reason that it's mandatory for you to wear a seatbelt while you drive. If you don't wear a seatbelt, you are exposing yourself to much greater risk of death in the event of an accident. In the same vein, if you are not vaccinated, you are putting your health at much greater risk. Any argument of, but more freedom, is moronic. You do not have the freedom to kill yourself. In fact, a more accurate analogy for this would be drink driving laws. You are not allowed to drive while drunk, because if you do and you crash, you are not just putting yourself at risk, but whoever innocent people you happen to crash into. In the same way, if you do not get vaccinated, it is not only putting your health at risk, but the health of everybody else around you, such as those who are immunocompromised due to recent cancer treatment, or those who are allergic to this vaccine and therefore couldn't take it. You do not have the freedom to kill yourself and potentially take others with you. So, what's to be done? Usually I'm not a fan of the sentiment of vote blue no matter who, and I think the practice of tactical voting is a poor reflection on a democracy. But when the alternative to voting blue is a real-life version of The Handmaid's Tale, and policies that would no doubt render millions of queer people across the country unsafe, potentially to the point of making them refugees having to flee to another country, yeah, tactical voting might be okay on this one. I know I haven't set out to do deeper political analysis like I did with my last video on this topic, but I don't think it was necessary this time. This 920-page pile of horse manure was not subtle, it was not nuanced. Its authoritarian fantasies were outlined so obviously that it was almost comical. It was not based in reality, no matter how much it pretends to be. I made this video simply to make people aware of this document, as many people still do not know about it, or if they are, they haven't read it. Their rhetoric only has as much power over the fearful and the uninformed. This is why we mock these buffoons. This document is a part of a plan to drag America back towards theocracy. In modern times, we have separated the church out of more and more areas of life, and it no longer holds the power that it used to. Never forget what self-proclaimed holy men did to others when they had the power to do so. Make no mistake, they want that power back, and we must not let them reclaim even an inch of it.